body, mammalian body, which is the kidney. So the kidney has several functions, like most organ systems in the body. One of the most important ones is that it's controlled to regulate the volume of the fluid in the body. As soon as you have osmotically active substances in any body cell, osmosis starts, and that will attract or secrete fluid from or into the cell. Okay, and that is true, of course, for the cardiovascular system, especially when it comes to sodium. We will talk a lot about sodium. If you remove the sodium in the body cells in the blood, then you attract water, means the blood volume increases, which is eventually a burden to the cardiovascular system. And the same is also true, of course, for the cell volume, the volume of cells. Cells will start to swell if there's a lot of osmotically active substances in these cells. It's also important in order to regulate, to control the amount and the number of electrolytes in the body, like sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, and so forth. So we will talk about that, how this is done by the kidney. In this context, when we come back to that, when we talk about the respiratory system, we also have to talk about protons, means the pH, of course. In addition, and this is what we talk about in much more detail when we talk at the end of the pulmonary system, the breathing system, it's also important to talk about acid-base balances. We play an important role in maintaining this so-called homeostasis, this balance between acids and bases, okay, together with the respiratory system. It's also important to get rid of waste products, mostly of the protein metabolism that are produced by the body, like urea, creatinine, etc. Thank you. And other foreign substances like drugs, penicillin, for instance, when you take drugs, they cannot stay forever in the body. They have to be excreted or secreted. You have to get rid of them. And in this context, of course, the kidney also that is based mostly on the fact that basically all the blood at one point or another circulates through the kidney. It's a very important site to release hormones that then circulate through the body, through the circulatory system, eventually reach their target organs. And the same is actually also true for the respiratory system. Something that we're not going to talk about, it's also important to, as an inactive precursor, in order to convert an inactive precursor of a particular vitamin D, into its active form. Again, the kidney played an important role in this context, but we will not cover that here. This is just way too. So what we're going to do today, before we talk about in much more detail about the water reabsorption or release on Wednesday, we will talk about basically the structure of the kidney, basic anatomy. Then we will talk about basic filtration mechanisms, and in your handouts you have unfinished slides, and I will post after class, I will post the finished slides. You can complete them in class, or you can wait till I've posted them. It's up to you. And we will also talk about the basic steps in reabsorption of these important ions and nutrients that involve the kidney. So what is the kidney? The kidney is situated, it's a paired organ. It's in the back of the body cavity. It has two portions that are slightly asymmetrical. We'll talk about the details a little later. So first we have the kidney, then we have a ureter that transports the urine from the kidney to a storage unit, which is the bladder. And then we have the bladder, which stores, at least temporarily, the urine. And the urine is then secreted or excreted through the urethra into the environment. Okay? So these are the basic components of basically the kidney, or what is together with the kidney. When you blow up the kidney, you see that it's made out of several components. First of all, we have what's called the renal capsule. This This is a capsule that surrounds the entire kidney, both of them, which is basically just a layering, it doesn't have function other than protection. In addition, we have two basic structures. The top structure of the kidney, the inside of the kidney, which is called the cortex, and underneath we have the medulla, which is made up of different structures. We'll talk about this in detail in a little bit. Finally, we have blood organs that supply the kidney with blood, the renal artery that enters the kidney, and also a vein, the renal vein, that transports the blood from the kidney back into the circulatory system, the rest of the circulatory system. Finally, we have the structure underneath the renal medulla that is called the renal papilla, that collects the excretions of the kidney and sends this to the renal pelvis, which is the opening underneath of basically the ureter into the kidney itself. And then these secretions, the urine, is excreted into the ureter and delivered to the storage unit, the bladder. Okay? So this is the basic structure. Each of these portions of the kidney are made up of, in humans, about 1 million or so different basic elements. They're all more or less the same. They're called nephrons. So nephron is basically a mini kidney, and this is shown here. So you have a portion of the nephron, I think I highlighted one of them, that's situated in the top portion, in the cortex portion, and then there's two portions also that extend into, way down into the, this is shown here in a blow-up. So you have the cortex portion here, and then you also have the medulla, and you see that part of this nephron, each of those nephrons, extends way down into the medulla. There's differences now, I'll talk about this on Wednesday, at least briefly, between different animals depending on how much they have to extract, reabsorb the water or not, in terms of the length of this extension into the cortex. So that's an important aspect that we're going to touch upon on Wednesday in much more detail. So the kidney is made, the cortex and the medulla is made up of, in humans, millions of little nephrons. Each of these nephrons consists of, this is a draw of one of those nephrons, a renal capsule, this is shown here, this is one component, a renal corpuscle, which is made up of a Bowman's capsule, here in the middle, surrounded by the, oops, this is shown here, this is the Bowman's capsule, that surrounds a vascular component which is called the glomerulus. We'll talk about this in much more detail. So a renal corpuscle is made up of a corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is made up of a glomerulus, a vascular component surrounded by this Bowman's capsule. Okay. In addition to this renal corpuscle, we have also tubes that connect these, especially the Bowman's capsule, that are hooked up to this Bowman's capsule and that relay these secretions that are formed in the renal corpuscle eventually to the urethra and the ureter. And these connections, they're called tubules. And we distinguish different portions of such a nephron. We distinguish the proximal tubule that comes right next to Bowman's capsule and is limited basically more or less to the cortex portion. This is here the proximal, sometimes also called proximal convoluted tubule. You can omit the convoluted, it's really important. In addition, we have this portion of the nephron that extends down into the medulla, and we have a thick portion in the proximal and the distal portion of this so-called loop of Henle, which is this U-shaped portion of this nephron that extends down into the medulla. And as I said, we have a proximal, fat, straight portion that is not convoluted anymore, and we have a distal fat, if you want, portion of this loop of Henle. We have a descending limb of the loop of Henle that goes down to the bottom of the cortex, the medulla, and we have an ascending limb that comes back up from the bottom of the medulla. Okay. In addition to this loop of Henle, we have again at the end, usually limited to the cortical portion, we have a convoluted portion which is a little thicker and obviously has different functions than the other ones, and that is called this is the distal convoluted, or just distal tubule that is followed, and this is sort of, you cannot really cut this off straight. It's followed by a connecting tubule that hooks all these different tubules up to the final portion, this collecting duct that enters here into the renal papilla and releases whatever is in these tubules into eventually the urethra. Okay? So this is the basic composition of such a nephron. In addition to these tubular components in the renal corpuscle, you have tons of blood vessels that surround these tubules and the renal corpuscle. That's shown here. So you have, as I said, you have a afferent artery that supplies the blood to the nephron, and you have a vein, a renal vein, that takes the blood back from this nephron, or these millions of nephrons, back and delivers it to the rest of the circulatory systems. Each of these so-called afferent veins splits into different arterioles, smaller portions. I think I said vein, I mean arteries. So each of these renal arteries, the left and right, splits into several hundreds, thousands of renal afferent arterioles. And they make up, and we'll talk about this in a second, this glomerulus right here. And after this glomerulus, whatever happens there we'll discuss in a minute, you have an efferent arteriole that leaves the nephron and eventually wraps around all these different tubules in a very particular way. We'll talk about this also next Wednesday in much more detail. And eventually this whole network of so-called glomerulus, you have the afferent arteriole that supplies the glomerulus with blood, then you have the efferent arteriole that leaves the glomerulus and enters this meshwork of arterioles, which are called peritubular capillaries, because they surround all these different portions of the tubules. And eventually, of course, they leave these nephrons and enter the veins that eventually then transport the blood back to the rest of the circulatory system. So this is the basic component of these things. So in these tubules, why do we have those tubules? In these tubules, what we have is whatever is filtrated out of this glomerulus, of this blood that enters the glomerulus. So we'll have to talk about the structure, the fine structure of the glomerulus in just a second. So what's inside of these tubules? This is all the good stuff that enters, about 20% of the blood, roughly, that enters the glomerulus, ends up in these tubules, in these different portions of tubules, and that's called the filtrate. It's not called the urea yet because we still have to reabsorb and secrete some substances. Urea is actually only called when it enters the renal papilla at the very end. Okay, so this is the filtrate, or sometimes also called ultrafiltrate, in those tubules. So we have to talk about this in much more detail. This is the tubular component. We talked about the different components of the tubules already. So we have the Bowman's capsule, we have the proximal tubule, we have the loop of Henle, a descending and an ascending limb. We have the so-called juxtaglomerular apparatus, which we talk about in just a second, which is right here, shown in green right here, where the ascending limb of the convoluted tubule actually meets the afferent and efferent artery. It's right there, right next to Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. And then we have a distal tubule, and finally we have a collecting duct and collecting tubule. So I'm not going to go into detail here again. So this is what happens. This shows schematically the Bowman's capsule, the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole. Here the efferent arteriole brings the blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole that takes the blood away from this glomerulus. What happens in this glomerulus is that blood is, or whatever can fit through those meshes, the sieve basically that builds this glomerulus, into these different portions of the tubule, first in Bowman's capsule, and then in these different portions of the tubules. So what happens here, the first thing that happens is the filtration, glomerular filtration. It turns out that about 20%, at least in humans, about 20% of the blood that enters Bowman's capsule, that enters the glomerulus, is filtrated out. So 80% remains. Then what we have one process which is called the tubular reabsorption. So whatever is filtrated out ends up in this filtrate in the lumen of these tubules, and if it's good stuff like glucose or other amino acids, for instance, they have to be reabsorbed back into this bloodstream. So this is what happens in these different portions of the tubules. And finally, we also have, eventually, to get rid of certain substances that have not been able to be filtrated out in this filtration process in the glomerulus. So we have a secretion process, tubular secretion. So we have to talk about those different portions that happen in the nephron. Glomerular filtration, the tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. Okay? So this is what we're going to do today. So eventually, of course, when all this is finished, you end up with what's called the urine. This is then drained into eventually the ureter, and then stored in the bladder, gallbladder. In the kidney bladder. Okay. So as I said, about almost everything in the filtrate consists of salts, different types of salts, and water, and that has to be obviously then reabsorbed, at least in a healthy organism, right? So we have to talk a lot about reabsorption, what happens in these different portions of the kidney. It turns out that most of the reabsorption of the most important components, like all the nutrients and the amino acids, happens actually right away in this proximal portion of the tubular components, the proximal tubules, right? The loop of Henle, the ascending and the descending portion of the loop of Henle, they also participate in the reabsorption, but they specialize in certain electrolytes. We'll talk about this in much more detail later on. And finally, we have the distal portions of the tubules and the collecting duct, and also the collecting tubule that participate also in the reabsorption, but obviously most of this reabsorption already happened. Most of it, as I said, in the proximal tubule. But there's still something left in the filtrate that has to be reabsorbed. In addition, mostly the distal components also participate in the secretion of substances, mostly actually potassium. Right? Potassium is very bad for an animal cell in most cases, and most of it has to be gotten rid of in the excretions. Right? So this is what also happens in the kidney. So this is just basic renal processes. This is listed as here what happens in the proximal tubule. As I said, most of this reabsorption and a little bit of the secretion, but mostly reabsorption happens in the proximal tubule. In the loop of Henle, there's also some reabsorption happening, mostly of sodium, also a little bit of chloride, but mostly sodium. In the distal tubules, there's still some reabsorption happening. Again, it concerns mostly sodium and chloride, the salt, sodium chloride. It's also the major site of calcium reabsorption, but we'll not talk about this in detail. Finally, there's the collecting tubules, and we'll talk about this in much more detail tomorrow and on Wednesday. They're involved in collecting duct also. They're involved in water reabsorption mostly, and that can change depending on the needs of the animal. Okay, in addition, this is also the portion where there's a lot of secretion happening more than in the proximal tubule, and the secretion concerns mostly potassium ions and also protons. Means this is the portion where the pH of the urea is affected the most. Okay. Oh, finally, since most of these processes, these transport processes across the epithelial layer involve different transport proteins, they can also, and this is true for both portions that are located in the cortex and also in the medulla, they can be affected by different hormones like vasopressin, for instance, and we'll talk about this again in much more detail on Wednesday. Okay. So why does the kidney first gets basically rid of everything or almost everything and then gets through this trouble of reabsorbing most of it? Again, this sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? So why do you think that is? And of course, this is all hand-waving. Nobody has a final, definitive answer to this. One possible aspect of this could be that there is simply no active transporter, no significant active transporter for this filtrate, right? So, or the waste products that the body has to get rid of, like, for instance, urea. So this is why the kidney basically first gets rid of basically everything and then gets through this trouble of reabsorbing the important things again. But again, this is really just hand waving. So I'm going to. Well, this just shows the blood flow, and this is a little. Well, it's not totally perfect and not totally correct actually what's shown here. So this just shows you that the blood enters. This is one nephron here. Enters the nephron through the one split portion of the renal artery, the arteriole, the afferent arteriole. It reaches this glomerulus, and after the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole leaves this whole system and wraps around these different portions of the tubule. And it turns out that it wraps around in a particular way, and we'll talk about this in much more detail on Wednesday. It wraps around in a particular way before it eventually leaves this nephron. It leaves the nephron through the renal, or one portion of the renal vein. Right? So this is just, and an important aspect of this whole thing is that each blood volume enters only one glomerulus. This is not that one blood enters one glomerulus and then is relayed to the second or third or fourth glomerulus. The blood, the entire blood, 20% of the blood is filtrated only in one glomerulus at one point in time. Then it's recirculated through the body. Of course, eventually it re-enters the kidney again, and then it might actually be filtrated in a different glomerulus. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. So this is again the two different components of the nephron: the renal corpuscle that consists of Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus, and the renal tubules, different portions of the renal tubule that come afterwards. So let's now first talk about what the glomerulus actually looks like in detail. It's basically really just a sieve that consists of different layers. This is shown here in a blow-up. This is the afferent arteriole that brings in the blood. This is the efferent arteriole that drains this glomerulus. And you see that the glomerulus sits inside of Bowman's capsule. And this glomerulus is surrounded by a lumen that collects whatever is pushed through the sieve that is made up of the. Where does this look? Here. That makes up the sieve, that makes up the mesh of the glomerulus. Okay, and you see that the whole. This is a blow-up of, let's say, this portion of the sieve, this portion of the glomerulus. You see that it is made up of basically three layers. One layer which corresponds to the inside of the glomerulus, basically the endothelial capillary cells. And you see that they're not tightly packed. They're clefts in between. Right? This is this one portion of the sieve. You see that This is one capillary endothelial cell, this is the second one, this is the third one. You see that in between there's a gap. The gap is in the neighborhood of about 100 nanometers or so. It's big enough to not to let like red blood cells through, but many other substances can actually pass through these big clefts. Underneath this layer of capillary endothelial cells, there comes this basilar membrane, or basal lamina, right, which is this interstitial space, very complicated. We talked about this last time. And slightly charged, it's basically an acellular component. And finally, you have these so-called, these filtration slits between adjacent foot processes, podocytes, that sit opposite to these capillary endothelial cells. The gaps between adjacent podocytes is even more narrow than the gaps between adjacent endothelial cells. It's in the neighborhood of 10 or 20 or so nanometers. You see that, so this is the diffusion pathway through which the filtrate has to pass. First it has to pass between adjacent endothelial cells that make up the walls of these glomeruli, the inside. Then it has to be basically squeezed through, filtrated through the basal lamina, and eventually it has to be squeezed through these adjacent podocytes. And eventually it enters this space, this lumen of Bowman's capsule, where it's basically trapped, this space here, that collects all the filtrate and relays it to these following tubules, right? The proximal tubule, lubophaline, the distal tubule, collecting duct, and so forth, right? So, you see that these different aspects of this sieve have different fenestrations, openings, basically gaps, width of gaps. So the biggest one is between adjacent endothelial cells, and the most narrow one is the inside, the inner layer of Bowman's capsule, which is only in the neighborhood of a few nanometers or so, usually less than 10 nanometers. Okay, so the sieve gets tighter and tighter. So there's still sieve present, but it's very selective in terms of what it allows to pass through, right? But nevertheless, many of these ions, and sometimes even if, especially when there's plenty of present glucose and also amino acids, will be able to pass through the sieve, this glomerulus, and end up in the filtrate inside Bowman's capsule. So we have to reabsorb this. And in order to understand how this reabsorption occurs, we have to do a little math, just basic math, and that is determining basically how much filtrate we create. The amount of filtrate that is created in Bowman's capsule, in the renal corpuscle, depends on basically many more, but basically what we look at is four components. Two components push the filtrate from the blood phase into the space that makes the inside of Bowman's capsule. And two other pressures basically act against these two pressures. So we have to talk about this. One portion of these pressures on both sides comes from the pressure of the filtrate and or the blood. It's called the hydrostatic pressure. So this whole relationship between those four pressures that makes up this famous Stirling's law, and the forces that determine how much filtrate is produced, the glomerular filtration rate, that is first how big the hydrostatic pressure is in the glomerulus, in the capillary net that builds this glomerulus, right? If you have a lot of hydrostatic pressure, a lot of blood pressure in these glomeruli, you will end up with a lot of filtrate. If you have a lower blood pressure, you have less amount of filtrate being created, okay? So the glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure, this is one component that determines how much filtrate is produced, and it's abbreviated with PGC. It doesn't matter. In addition, also pulling filtrate out of this glomerulus is what's called a oncotic pressure. Oncotic pressure is actually a pressure that is based on the presence or absence of mostly proteins. So if you have a high oncotic pressure, you have many proteins present. If you have a low oncotic pressure, you have very few proteins present. since in the filtrate in Bowman's capsule there's very few proteins present, the oncotic pressure that squeezes out even more filtrate out of the blood phase in the glomerulus is very low. But nevertheless, we have to consider this. Okay? So these are the two pressures that increase the filtration rate when they're big. Okay? Big hydrostatic pressure, a lot of filtration, and big oncotic pressure in Bowman's capsule. It's abbreviated pi BC. That also increases the amount of filtrate. Opposite to that, we have also the hydrostatic pressure of the fluid that sits inside of Bowman's capsule. So if the hydrostatic pressure of the filtrate is very high, then you push filtrate back into the blood phase of the glomerulus, right? And the same is true of course, of all these substances, these proteins mostly, that remain in the blood, means that exert a oncotic pressure in the blood phase. So if the oncotic pressure in the glomerular phase is high, you try to attract, reabsorb, basically filtrate from the inside of Bowman's capsule. So these two pressures oppose each other. The hydrostatic pressure in the glomerulus, that if it's high, increases the glomerular filtration rate. The oncotic pressure that is found in the glomerulus, in Bowman's capsule, if it's high, it attracts even more filtrate. And those two forces are opposed by the opposite forces, namely the hydrostatic pressure of the filtrate inside Bowman's capsule. If it's high, it pushes a lot of filtrate back into the blood. And the oncotic pressure in the blood phase. If it's high, it also reabsorbs basically a lot of filtrate back into the blood phase. Okay? So the Starling's law basically is an equation that is made up of those four forces or pressures, namely the glomerular filtration pressure and the oncotic pressure in Bowman's capsule, minus the opposing forces, namely the hydrostatic pressure in Bowman's capsule, plus the oncotic pressure in the blood phase. And this is basically Starling's law. This is those four forces that oppose each other. And when you measure those forces, how we don't talk about, you see that you have a high hydrostatic pressure in the blood phase, about 60 millimeters mercury, whatever that means. You have very little proteins being squeezed through. It means the oncotic pressure in the filtrate inside Bowman's capsule is basically zero, close to zero. Right? This is the first portion here. And then we have to subtract the opposing forces, means the hydrostatic pressure in the filtrate, which happens to be around 15 or so millimeters mercury, and the oncotic pressure of these blood proteins. It's around 30 or 29 or so millimeters mercury. And when you add all these things up, you end up with a total glomerular filtration pressure that is around 16 millimeters mercury, which is greater than zero, obviously. This is why you end up with this filtrate. Okay? So these numbers are important to memorize, basically, and if you have a patient, then you have to be able to measure those different numbers and find out what's wrong with these things. So, this is the glomerular filtration pressure. Now, just a little math, you don't have to memorize this. You can basically forget about this slide. This is just to show you that we have glomerular filtration pressure that is about 60 millimeters mercury. We have plasma flow, blood flow through the kidney that is about 625 or so milliliters per minute. And so that ends up then being a glomerular filtration rate, if you get those two numbers together, of about 125 milliliters per minute, which is about 180 liters per day, which is an enormous amount of filtrate that is produced based on the 60 millimeters mercury filtration pressure, okay? And the large amount of blood that flows through the nephrons, the kidney. Just as comparison, in systemic capillaries, you have much less filtration rate. The filtration pressure in systemic capillaries is just a fraction of what you have in the kidneys, about 1 or 2 or 3 millimeters mercury. So it's much lower. And that ends up being a filtration rate in the systemic capillaries of much less than what you have in the kidney, about 2 to 3 to 4 liters per day. Okay, so that shows you how important the kidney actually really is in producing this filtrate. It turns out, as I said, about 20% of the blood that enters this glomerulus is actually filtrated out. It's not everything, but it's a significant amount. About 1/5 or so is filtered out. It's based upon all these different calculations. And just a note at the end, this filtration rate cannot be measured directly. But it can be measured, but it has to be done indirectly. And you can measure this only, and this is what you do then when you actually do this in a patient, by basically comparing the amount of waste products, creatinine for instance, in the urine with what you find in the blood. Right? So there is no direct measurement possible of glomerular filtration rate. You have to do this indirectly through comparing of different waste products, for instance creatinine or urea, in the filtrate versus what you have in the blood. Okay, so this is just an important aspect. So why is this? Actually, I'm not going to go into this detail. This is a question: why is the filtration rate so high? Why do you have so much filtration rate? If the filtration rate is so high, 16 or whatever milliliters mercury, isn't eventually all the blood filtrated through this glomerulus and ends up as filtrate into tubules? And the answer is no. And why is that? Well, once filtrate leaves the blood becomes sort of thicker, right? Means the oncodic pressure increases, right? There's relatively more proteins left in the remaining blood. And eventually you reach this so-called filtration equilibrium. The equilibrium between what's filtrated out and what is sort of reabsorbed or tried to be reabsorbed back, between of this increased oncodic pressure in the blood that leaves these nephrons. Okay? So this is why we have this equilibrium between producing filtrate and filtrate trying to re-enter the blood flow. Okay? So not everything enters, not all the blood ends up in the filtrate. You still have about 80% of the blood leaving these nephrons. Okay? So it's a simple answer. Okay, so just before we take a break, I want to briefly say that the filtration rate is actually highly regulated, and it has to be highly regulated. That is shown in two extreme cases. For instance, in one case where the filtration rate increases, and it increases when you have a higher glomerular filtration pressure, and this is usually the case when the glomerular oncodic pressure is very, very low. And it's low for instance, in cases where you have a lot of skin burned, in severely burned patient, for instance. The glomerular filtration pressure is very low because this severely burned patient lost a large quantity of protein-rich plasma-derived fluid because a lot of the skin is burnt. So the filtration rate is increasing, which is obviously not a good thing. That's why being burned is not a good thing. On the other hand, we can have the opposite, means we have a very low filtration pressure, and that can happen when this patient lost a lot of liquids. For instance, when the patient has dehydrating diarrhea, for instance, right, for whatever reason. Right? That's then the aspect of the physician to determine the problem that he or she is facing. Okay? So these are the two extreme cases where we can have a very high filtration rate when the oncodic pressure in the blood is very low, or we can have a very low filtration rate when the patient lost a lot of fluids. Okay, so this is called a unregulated effect on the filtration rate. In addition, of course, we also have the Bowman's capsule hydrostatic pressure that is involved due to this Stalling equation in controlling how much filtrate is produced. Right? I mentioned that before briefly. In addition to this, this external aspects of the glomerular, the regulation of the glomerular filtration in, for instance, a severely burned patient or the patient that has dehydrating diarrhea. We see actually that even small changes in the glomerular filtration rate are usually controlled, very precisely controlled and very quickly actually controlled. And that turns out to be based upon mostly changes in the glomerular capillary blood pressure. So we see here when you plot, like in this graph, the glomerular filtration pressure or rate, the higher up you go, the higher the glomerular filtration rate is, versus the mean arterial pressure. You see that the glomerular filtration rate does not change. It changes for low arterial pressures down here, and for very high arterial pressures. It happens to be below 80 and above 180 millimeters mercury for the mean arterial pressure. But between roughly 80 and 180, the change is very, very small of the glomerular filtration rate. Means this is really an area here, this area, where we have a lot of control mechanisms at play, and they're called intrinsic, right? So these are autogenic or intrinsic control mechanisms, feedback mechanisms, that regulate how much filtrate is produced, despite the fact that the mean arterial pressure changes over a wide range from 80 to 180, right? Usually the average arterial pressure is, as you know, is around 120, 130, 140 millimeters mercury, okay? But over this wide range from roughly 80 to 180, glomerular filtration rate does not change. And this can only be happening because we have additional feedback mechanisms that control this filtration rate. And it turns out that we have intrinsic feedback mechanisms and we have extrinsic feedback mechanisms, mostly outside of the kidney, feedback mechanism outside of the working range of the kidney, usually below 80 and above 180. We talked about this severely burned patient and the patient with dehydrated diarrhea already. These are two examples of extrinsic mechanisms. Now let's talk about the intrinsic mechanism. It turns out to be that we have basically two mechanisms. One mechanism you already know. This is simply based upon the fact that the walls of these endothelial cells that build the capillaries detect the mean arterial pressure. For instance, in this example, we have the fact that the mean arterial pressure, MAP, increases, right? That means that in the afferent arteriole, the blood pressure also, in the hydrostatic pressure also increases. And that usually increases the filtration rate, right? But it turns out that this increase in the pressure, blood pressure of the afferent arteriole is also detected by the walls of these endothelial cells. If they detect an increase in blood pressure, they are stretched more, and then those baroreceptors that sit in the walls of these endothelial cells, they detect the stretch and they start to counteract the stretch, they constrict, right? Which now reduces that increases the resistance and that counterbalances through this negative feedback, this increase in pressure that is caused by this increase in the mean arterial pressure. Okay? If you constrict the walls of these endothelial cells, you increase the resistance and you reduce the amount of filtrate that is produced, right? And that counterbalances this increased blood pressure that is caused by this increased mean arterial pressure. This is one mechanism that you already know. Very simple. It's found also in systemic capillaries, of course. So, and this second mechanism now, that involves an organ that you don't know about yet. We mentioned briefly this juxtaglomerular apparatus already when we talked about the fine structure of this nephron. It is found right between the afferent and efferent arteriole, where the distal tubule, basically in the cortex of the nephron, where the distal tubule bypasses those two portions of the arteriole, the one that enters the glomerulus and the one that leaves the glomerulus. It's right here. So this is where this juxtaglomerular apparatus is located. When you blow this up, you see this is the portion of the arteriole, afferent arteriole, that enters this glomerulus, and this is the portion that leaves. This is the efferent arteriole. This is the portion, the blood that leaves the glomerulus. And you see that, right? This is the. Sorry, come on. This is the distal tubule that ascends in the cortex, right next to this splitting of afferent and efferent arteriole. And you see that we have two components, two cellular components, that make up this portion of the nephron. One is shown here in purple, and it consists of different subportions. Most of these cells, these specialized cells, which are called granular cells because they look granular, they're found actually next to the incoming blood, right? There's also a little bit found here next to the outgoing blood, but most of these granular cells are found next to the incoming blood, next to in the walls basically of the afferent arteriole. And there's a second component that's shown here that's called the macula densa. This is a widening of the walls of the distal tubule. And we'll talk about this much later, what the macula densa actually does. We'll come back to the juxtaglomerular apparatus on Wednesday again. So the tuboglomerular feedback consists of two, obviously, elements. One involves the granular cells, and the second one concerns these macula densa cells. And it turns out that the macula densa cells, the granular cells, they basically secrete, we'll come back to the granular cells on Wednesday. They secrete a sort of hormone, renin usually. And this hormone involves the response of, again, blood vessels. As I said, we'll talk about this feedback mechanism on Wednesday in much more detail. It's very important. The macula densa cells now that sit in the distal tubule, they detect basically the amount of filtrate that's leaving the nephron, in the collecting in these thicker portions of the distal tubules, right? And they also, so they detect mostly the sodium concentration in the filtrate, which is the most obvious component. And they also secrete what's called a paracrine substance, which is also a hormone that acts actually only locally. It's not distributed throughout the body like most hormones are. It's acting only locally, and it acts when it's present, as a constrictor of blood vessels, right? And that's exactly what you want. When you have too much filtrate, sodium concentration that is too high, you want to reduce the filtration rate, right? So you want to constrict the blood vessels, and this is exactly what it does. Usually, that's why it's found mostly around these afferent arterioles. It constricts mostly the afferent arterioles, and that increases the blood pressure inside of these afferent arterioles, which reduces according to Starling's law, the amount of filtrate, the glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so this is the second aspect of this intrinsic mechanism. Okay, and this is shown here in this case. So this is it. There's no feedback present. You have an increase, for instance, of the mean arterial pressure. The pressure in these blood vessels, for instance, the afferent arteriole increases. You have an increased filtration rate, and you have an increased flow within all these different portions of the tubules, including the distal tubule, that builds the portion of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And this now is detected by these macula densa cells, and that causes this release of this paracrine hormone, which is usually considered to be similar at least to ATP, which causes, when it's released, a local vasoconstriction, mostly in the afferent arterioles, means a reduction, this is this negative feedback, of this glomerular filtration pressure. Okay? So this is the second portion, in addition to this presence or absence of baroreceptors in the the walls of the capillaries. This is the second mechanism, intrinsic mechanism, orthogenic mechanism that controls the glomerular filtration rate within this wide range of 80 to 180 millimeters mercury. Okay, so this is what keeps this portion of this portion of this curve, this increase of glomerular filtration with increasing mean arterial pressure. This is what keeps those two mechanisms, intrinsic mechanisms. This is what keeps this filtration rate more or less constant over this very wide range of mean arterial pressures. Okay. So now, when we briefly talk about falling below this mystical 80 or whatever millimeters mercury, which can mean arterial pressure, which can happen if you lose, for instance, a lot of blood due to a lot of hemorrhage, for instance, or a lot of sweating also, if you lose a lot of body fluids. Then the blood mean arterial pressure falls below 80 millimeters, or can fall below 80 millimeters mercury, and then the reabsorption has to increase in order to bring the filtration rate back up again. Okay, and we talked about some of these mechanisms. Yeah, this slide is just a summary again of this reabsorption that shows you that it's. We'll talk about this in the following after the break in much more detail. Reabsorption is really absolutely necessary to maintain all these cells, body cells, happy, because most of these substances that actually are not supposed to leave the blood have to be reabsorbed from the filtrate back into the blood. And we'll talk about this the second half of this lecture in much more detail about how this happens in these different portions of these nephrons. Okay, so basically almost everything is, basically 99% is reabsorbed before whatever the waste products actually are allowed to leave these tubules. Okay? And just remember that most of it actually occurs, of this reabsorption occurs in the proximal tubule, so this is where we have to spend most of the time talking about. And it's actually in this proximal tubule, it's not, the reabsorption is not regulated, at least not highly regulated. But it is very selective. And we'll talk about these aspects in just a second. And this is just the table. You don't have to memorize the details. This is just to show you that all these different substances, except for urea and potassium also, basically everything is reabsorbed almost completely, close to 100%. Okay? Only the really waste products like urea or also potassium are allowed to actually stay in this filtrate, which then eventually becomes urea or urine. Okay? Everything else is reabsorbed. So we have to talk about tubular reabsorption now in the fall. Let's take a 10-minute break and then talk about reabsorption mechanisms in different portions of the nephron. Okay? 10 minutes, still fine. The doors are usually open. Okay? So right after class, from 12 basically to 1, it's in the old Life Science building on the 4th floor. As I said, on Monday and Wednesday after class. Okay? So, let's wrap this up. Let's talk about the details of the reabsorption, mostly reabsorption that happens in these tubules. And this is a scheme that shows you again here. You have the filtrate in the inside of these tubules. And the tubules are lined with these specialized epithelial cells. And this is 3 on the left and 3 on the right side, or 2.5. You see the gap junctions in between, the tight junctions. In between you have the fact that, let's look at the middle one. Here you have the luminal membrane, which is the apical portion of this endothelial cell, right? And on this other side of these tight junctions, the very tight ones or the not so tight ones, they are slightly leaky, you have the basolateral portion, or membrane. This is shown for this epithelial cell. So all this is the lateral or the basal, or together the basolateral portion of this epithelial cell. Okay? And what you have is that these substances that are being reabsorbed from the filtrate have to pass first through the apical portion of all these different epithelial cells, and then eventually through the basolateral portion, membranes of these epithelial cells like here. Then they have to diffuse through the interstitial fluid that surrounds all cells in any tissue of the body. And eventually they have to enter the blood flow in these tissue cells. For instance, all these peritubular capillaries that surround the different portions of the tubules. Okay? And then eventually, of course, this blood leaves the nephron and forms the renal vein, which re-enters or delivers the blood to the remainder of the cardiovascular system. Okay? So this is all these different portions that have to happen and that we have to talk about. It turns out that the tubular reabsorption, that most, as I said, repeatedly, most of it happens in the proximal tubule, and this involves the reabsorption of glucose, amino acids, means relatively big substances, not as big as red blood cells, but still much bigger than most ions. And it also concerns the reabsorption of sodium mostly, but also bicarbonate and also chloride. And we'll talk about the details in a while. The loop of Henle, the other portion of this nephron that we have to talk about in much more detail, especially on Wednesday, that concerns mostly the reabsorption again of whatever has not been absorbed in terms of sodium and chloride, but it also concerns the reabsorption of potassium. And that also is happening not just in the loop of Henle, but also in the distal portions of the nephron. And when I say distal portions, I always include at least the connecting portions of the distal tubule, and sometimes even the connecting duct. This is not really that clear, the separation between those different portions. It's sort of a gray zone. Okay? So, water reabsorption, that's something that's also very important. I think I listed it as the primary function of the kidney. That's something that we're going to talk about in much more detail on Wednesday, how this has happened. Okay, so this is now what happens in the proximal tubule. And that concerns, for instance, the glucose reabsorption. And this turns out to be very, very similar, if not identical to what we already heard about how it happens in the small intestines. So you have here the apical membrane of these epithelial cells, for instance, this one, that lines the lumen of these tubules. So in here you would find the filtrate. The apical cell of these, especially the proximal tubules, they are highly, they contain a lot of microvilli. It means the surface area is really enlarged, just like in the small intestine, which makes the uptake of glucose via this SGLT transport mechanism that we already talked about, that co-transports also with glucose, also sodium in the same direction into the cytosol of this epithelial cell. And then on the basolateral portion of this epithelial cell that lines the proximal tubules, we have two things happening. One is that a GLUT transport mechanism, facilitated diffusion, gets rid of the glucose, which eventually enters these peritubular capillaries. And in addition, the sodium that enters the cytosol here of these epithelial cells, that also has to be exchanged and get rid of. And it turns out to involve this sodium-potassium pump mechanism that we talked about. So you have those three things happening in the proximal tubule. For instance, when it comes to glucose uptake, you have this coupled transport of glucose and sodium here by this SGLT transporter. Doesn't matter which type it is. On the apical side, coupled with on the basolateral portion of this epithelial cell, coupled with the sodium-potassium pump mechanism, which gets rid of the sodium that enters the cell, and also a GLUT transporter, facilitated diffusion of glucose out of the cytosol, and eventually into this blood that fills these peritubular capillaries. Okay? And the same is true, you can substitute glucose with amino acids. The same is true for amino acids They're also involving a SGLT transport mechanism on the apical side of these epithelial cells, coupled with a GLUT transporter on the basolateral portion and a sodium-potassium pump on the basolateral portion of this epithelial cell. Okay, that reabsorbs most, 99% or so, of the glucose and amino acids right away in the proximal portion of the nephron, these tubules that form the nephron. Okay, so this is very simple. Of course, as we heard when we talked about these transport mechanisms, certain hormones can affect the efficiency of these different transport mechanisms, and one is, for instance, also very obvious when the body becomes diseased, and that involves, in the case of glucose, of course, diabetes, and you see that, or you find that the reabsorption of glucose in the case of diabetes is reduced, right? Because those cells are less sensitive to the presence or absence of glucose, right? We talked about the details of this in last week, right? We have two types of diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2. In both cases, the reabsorption of glucose is reduced in the case of diabetes, okay? So, and that's obviously why there's more glucose left in the filtrate. Less is taken out, reabsorbed, more leaves eventually the body. Means those people with diabetes, they're hyperglycemic, okay? So it turns out, again, that in terms of sodium, I think we're limited to sodium now, the sodium ion, in the proximal tubule, about 2/3 or so of the sodium are already reabsorbed. There's still a significant amount of sodium that is left in the filtrate. So we need additional portions of the nephron that take care of this reabsorption of the sodium, the remaining portion. And this is now shown in these slides that I think I gave you just the incomplete portions, right? And I'm going to fill this out now here. So this is the apical portion of such an epithelial cell. This is the basolateral portion of the epithelial cell. These are these tight junctions. Okay. So first we have an SGLT transporter on the apical surface that brings in glucose, coupled with the inflow also of sodium. Okay. I'm going to post the completed slides after class, so don't worry if you cannot finish this in time. In addition to that, we also build up this gradient of sodium through another, actually even more efficient mechanism. This is not the symport that we have here in this coupled transport in the case of the SGLT. It's actually an antiport. We bring in sodium, but we secrete protons. So this antiport brings in sodium and releases protons into the filtrate. This is the second mechanism that happens on the apical side of these epithelial cells in the proximal tubule. Okay? In both cases, we build up this large sodium concentration. The sodium in the cytosol now has to be removed. First, of course, the glucose has to leave, which happens to be, just like we discussed, through facilitated diffusion. And the sodium has to leave the cytosol with the help of the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump brings in 2 potassium into the cell and releases 3 sodium from the cytosol into the space surrounding the basolateral membrane on the outside. Okay, so this is what happens, and this is what takes care of part of the elevated sodium concentration in the cytosol. In addition, you also have a co-transporter that eliminates even more sodium to the outside, from the cytosol to the outside, surrounding the basolateral membrane, together with another ion which is bicarbonate. Okay? This is just something you have to memorize. So you have 2 mechanisms that bring in sodium on the apical side and 2 mechanisms that get rid of sodium on the basolateral side, right? So, in addition, of course, you transport sodium from the filtrate eventually into the blood that surrounds the basolateral portion of the epithelial cell layer, and that means sodium is an osmotically active substance. With it, you also suck water from the filtrate into the blood, right? Which increases the blood pressure in the capillaries, the peritubular capillaries. Okay? So if you transport a lot of sodium from the filtrate to the capillaries surrounding the basolateral space, then you also suck in a lot of water from the filtrate. Okay? And the water can flow through specialized channels in these epithelial cells called aquaporins, or if the cells, and that's especially true in the proximal tubule, are kind of leaky, then also water will flow through this paracellular space through these leaky tight junctions. Okay? In any case, water enters the basolateral space from the apical space, from the filtrate. Okay? Because you transport a lot of mostly sodium from the filtrate to the basolateral space. Yeah. Because sodium attracts water. If you increase sodium on one side of this epithelial cell layer, then you also bring water, and mostly water, over from the filtrate into the space that is filled now with all the sodium. Okay? So water transport is always coupled with, for instance, the transport of basically all osmotically active substances. That includes mostly glucose, but also all these, mostly cations. Okay? So, this is one thing that happens. Now it turns out, and again, I would love to have a thing here, that we talked about this when we talked about these transport mechanisms. All these transport mechanisms can be inhibited competitively or non-competitively. In this case, it's actually not competitively. They're called, in general terms, substances that block certain transport mechanisms across this epithelial cell layer, whether it's apical side or basolateral side. They're called diuretics. And I list this name in a slide that comes a little later. This is one of those examples that inhibits this co-transporter, this symporter, the symporter that transports bicarbonate and sodium from the cytosol through the basolateral membrane into the space surrounding the basolateral membrane. And this diuretic is called stilbene. Okay, this is something you just have to, again, memorize. So if you want to reduce the amount of sodium, and with it, of course, water, that ends up in the space surrounding the basolateral membrane, means also these blood capillaries, then you have to block the transport of sodium, for instance, by using these diuretics, right? And this happens here with stilbene in the proximal tubule already, okay? It's a very efficient diuretic. Yes, the other question. Say it again, sorry? Oh, we'll talk about this when we talk about the end of the pulmonary section. You know this for now. Okay, this is one of those diuretics that happens to be active. This is just one example in the proximal tubule. Okay, so if you want to affect this, when you give those diuretics, if you want to basically increase urine, the amount of urine, reduce the blood pressure in the capillary system, then you apply diuretics, right? And if you want to do this right at the beginning, then you can use, for instance, stilbene, right? And another diuretic that also affects the proximal tubules mostly, that is now active on the apical portion of these epithelial cells. It's called amiloride. And this amiloride that blocks this antiport mechanism that brings in sodium from the filtrate and secretes protons out of the cytosol. Okay, these are examples of two
diuretics acting on the proximal tubule, and both affecting the amount of sodium that's eventually brought into the peritubular capillaries. Okay? And with it, of course, when you reduce the amount of sodium in the blood that sits in the peritubular capillaries, then you also reduce the blood pressure in these peritubular capillaries. So diuretics are a very, very efficient tool, and we'll talk about a few more that work in different portions of the nephron. They are a very potent mechanism to affect blood pressure through affecting sodium reabsorption. Okay? So, a side note here, amelioride, this diuretic that acts on the antiport in the apical membrane, that is something that also affects a transport mechanism that happens not in the proximal portion of the nephron, but in the very distal portion of the nephron, a particular type of cell, namely those principal cells. And we'll talk about this a little later here. Yeah. So if you reduce the amount of sodium that's transported across an epithelial cell layer by either reducing the reabsorption out of the filtrate on the apical side or the release on the basolateral side, then you reduce the blood pressure. Right? So diuretics are very efficient in doing that, and they are usually applied when people have chronic high blood pressure, for instance, or when there's an accumulation of water in the body. For instance, when people have emphysema, right? And that can have different causes. So it turns out now, again, in the proximal tubule, there's also another substance that's transported out of the filtrate, and that is bicarbonate. And it turns out that bicarbonate, and we come back to this formula, bicarbonate HCO3- is actually not transported as bicarbonate, it's transported as CO2. And that's easy to do because as soon as you have bicarbonate present in a water solution, it forms CO2 and water. Right? So this is, and it goes through this unstable component, carbonic acid. And this diffusion into CO2 and water is especially rapid and very fast when you have an enzyme present, carbonic anhydrase, that facilitates the diffusion of bicarbonate in protons into this unstable carbonic acid, and eventually water and CO2. Okay? So in this case, it's from the right to the left side. So if this Ca carbonic anhydrase is present, and it happens to be present in these walls that build the apical membrane, especially the proximal tubule. Now, so in these walls you have a lot of, so this is where the filtrate is located. And this is where we want to transport the CO2, the bicarbonate. Then we do this through the presence of carbonic anhydrase in these walls, in these apical walls of these epithelial cells that build the proximal tubule. So if the Ca is present, the carbonic anhydrase is present in this space, then it forms mostly CO2 and water from bicarbonate and protons, which are plentiful in the filtrate, right? And the CO2, as we heard at the very beginning, is easily able to squeeze through this phospholipid bilayer and enter the cytosol of these epithelial cells, where again, of course, there's plenty of water, so CO2 and water now forms, and there's also carbonic anhydrase present in the cytosol of all these cells, now forms very quickly bicarbonate in protons. The protons are pumped out again through this antiport mechanism that brings in a lot of sodium also, and the bicarbonate leaves the basolateral portion of these epithelial cells through the symport mechanism that brings out also sodium into the space surrounding the basolateral membrane. Okay? So that's important to remember, that this bicarbonate that eventually leaves these endothelial cells enters these endothelial cells not as bicarbonate, but as CO2. Okay? Which is very easy to do, simply by diffusion. Okay, so this is the CO2 that's generated through the presence of this plentiful carbonic anhydrase on the outside of the apical membrane of these epithelial cells. Okay, and eventually the CO2 is transformed in the cytosol into bicarbonate, which eventually leaves these cells through the basolateral membrane. Okay. Another electrolyte that has to be transported out of the filtrate back into the blood is, of course, chloride. Right? And it turns out that chloride, just like many other ions, actually moves across these epithelial layers passively. How is this done? Well, this is again what you saw before. It turns out that all these epithelial cell layers, especially the proximal portion of the tubule, they're actually very leaky. And since they're very leaky, many of these substances that are found in the filtrate inside here, in the lumen of the tubules, can pass through these leaky epithelium in this paracellular space surrounding the basolateral membrane. And it turns out that most of these ions, including again sodium, but also potassium and chloride and magnesium and calcium, and also water, of course, flows through these leaky epithelium because there's plentiful of these ions on this side in the filtrate and much, much less on the side surrounding the basolateral membrane. Okay? So if you open the floodgates, if you want, by introducing these leaky epithelium, then much of the stuff that is still found in the filtrate will simply follow its concentration gradient, basically, and diffuse over to the side where they are not as plentiful, means the side surrounding the basolateral membrane. Okay, so many of this, for instance, chloride here, but as I said, also the other substances, they simply follow the concentration gradient from the filtrate into the side surrounding the basolateral membrane, because they don't have to travel through the cytosol itself. They can diffuse through these very leaky tight junctions, these very leaky epithelial bindings, right? So now let's talk about another portion of these epithelial layers, namely the loop of Henle. And we'll come back to this loop of Henle on Wednesday when we talk about the reabsorption of water in much more detail. So the loop of Henle is mostly concerned with the reabsorption, again, of the remaining portion, or some of the remaining portions of the sodium. Again, remember, we have still about 1/3 of the sodium left in the filtrate. And also it's involved in the absorption of even more chloride and the secretion of potassium. Okay? So this is what happens in this loop of Henle, which is the portion in the medulla, this portion, and it happens to mostly occur actually in the portion that is ascending, and it happens to be in the thick, enlarged portion of the loop of Henle. So again, this is to show you what's happening. On the apical side of all these epithelial cells that make up the ascending portion of the loop of Henle, we have a symporter that transports all these different ions into the cytosol from the filtrate, namely sodium, potassium, but also chloride. They all are plentiful in the filtrate, and they're co-transported into the inside of these epithelial cells. Okay? The sodium, again, is eliminated from the cytosol at the basolateral side through a mechanism that we already know, through the sodium-potassium pump that gets rid of 3 sodium by taking up 2 potassium. The chloride leaves through chloride channels, very simple. They're plentiful on the basolateral side. And the potassium leaves the cytosol, again, through potassium channels, mostly on the apical side. Okay? So this is why this potassium elimination here is called secretion. It goes from the cytosol into the filtrate. And here on this side, the potassium, together with the sodium, and the chloride is actually reabsorbed, goes from the filtrate to the cytosol. In any case, what you generate here is actually an electrical gradient. Okay? And that is based on the fact that you have two positively charged ions entering the cytosol, and also together with two chloride ions, right, through this transporter. This is just a mechanism that happens. One positively charged ion actually leaves through the apical side again. So you end up with basically one positive charged ion and two negatively charged ions. Means a negative, overall negative charge. And on the other side, on the basolateral side, two of these chloride ions that leave the cytosol end up in the space surrounding the basolateral portion of this endothelial cell. And what you have here is, so you end up basically with a slightly positive charge on the apical side, right? Because you remove fewer of these positively charged ions, cations, and more of the negatively charged ions, chloride. And on the basolateral side, because this asymmetry, mostly of the potassium-sodium pump, sodium-potassium pump, that allows for this accumulation of fewer, so you bring two positively charged ions, cations, into the cell, and remove three outside of the cell. Means you have a net accumulation of one cation outside of the cell, but you have two anions, negatively charged ions, through those chloride channels. So this side, the basolateral side of this epithelial cell, actually becomes slightly negatively charged. And that electrogenic gradient, slightly positive inside versus slightly negative on the basolateral portion, outside, that now attracts, and the presence of these leaky epithelia, that now attracts even more of these osmotically active substances, like, for instance, water, and more of these, for instance, sodium also, from the side of the filtrate facing the apical portion of these epithelial cells back into the portion that surrounds the basolateral membrane. Okay? So, this is the fact that in the loop of Henle, not the proximal portion, the loop of Henle, mostly the ascending portion of the loop of Henle, you have the presence of an electrogenic gradient, slightly positive inside versus slightly negative outside, that pulls out even more sodium from the filtrate into the space here. And this is again these diuretics. Of course, the different pumps here can be affected by diuretics. Now, since these diuretics actually act on the loop portion of the nephron, the lymphophile, they're called loop diuretics. And it happens to be that most of these loop diuretics actually act on this triple symport that brings in sodium, potassium, and also chloride from the filtrate. So these loop diuretics inhibit these symports, or symporters, and end up, obviously, with less sodium inside the cell, means less sodium on the basolateral portion also, means the reduced sodium reabsorption, which also reduces this electrogenic gradient, right? Because less sodium now enters the cytosol and leaves the cytosol on the basolateral side. So this electrogenic gradient is gone, means there is even less sodium now being flushed out of the filtrate. Means less water also enters the space surrounding the basolateral membrane, means these diuretics increase the amount of water that is left in the filtrate, means basically the amount of urine that leaves the kidney. This is why they're called diuretics. Okay? They're still relatively potent because, remember, there's still 1/3 of sodium present in this portion of the nephron. Okay? So these diuretics, for instance, furosemide and bumetanide, these are trade names. The trade names are different. Those are generic names that for loop diuretics that are very, very potent in reducing the amount of sodium that's reabsorbed. Okay? So, finally, let's talk about the connecting tubule and the very distal portion of the tubule that's situated in the cortex. And what happens there is, again, we reabsorb. So this mechanism that we find in the loop of Henle gets rid of most of the sodium, but there's still some sodium left, about 5 to 10% or so. That has to be reabsorbed, and that happens in the very distal portion of the nephron, okay, of this tubular system. And it happens to involve a sodium chloride cotransport. So sodium enters from the filtrate into the cytosol of these epithelial cells on the, through the apical membrane together with chloride. Water, of course, also follows. Water can squeeze through the phospholipid bilayer. Those epithelia, they are actually not as leaky as the ones in the proximal tubule. They are more tight. So water has to pass basically through the cytosol, which it does here. There's also very few aquaporins present in this portion of the nephron, so it really has to go through the cytosol, but easily can. The sodium that accumulates in the cytosol, again, is eliminated at the basolateral portion through what we already know, this sodium-potassium pump. The chloride leaves the cytosol through, again, chloride channels in the basolateral membrane. Okay? So this is how the remaining 5 to 10% or so of the sodium and chloride is reabsorbed into the bloodstream that surrounds the basolateral portion of these epithelial cells. Okay? Again, the transport of sodium, in this case coupled with chloride, is affected by diuretics. In this example, in the very distal portion of the nephron, it's a different diuretic. It's called thiazide. Again, this is a generic name. Trade name is different, or has actually different names. This blocks this cotransport, the symport mechanism that brings in sodium and chloride from the filtrate into the cytosol of these epithelial cells. So if thiazide is present, then this intake, this reabsorption of sodium and also chloride will be reduced. Question: are these thiazides more powerful or less powerful than those loop diuretics? What do you think? Why are they less powerful?
Because there was a great...
Exactly, because there's much less sodium to be reabsorbed, blockage of sodium reabsorption in these distal portions of this nephron, right? If there's less present, then of course also the effect of whatever blocks this reabsorption, in this case thiazides, will be much lower than, for instance, in this loop of the limb of Henle, right? Yes. Say it again, sorry. Well, I don't know. This is just what you read in those textbooks. I'm not a physician, so I don't know. I mean, all I can say is that the thiazides are usually the first thing that is used as diuretics, because the effect of thiazides is much lower than loop diuretics, right? Simply because there is much less sodium reabsorption to be blocked, right? So if you can affect the accumulation of water in your blood, means just increased blood pressure, for instance, or the presence of emphysema or edema, if you can reduce these effects by applying thiazides, then you're happy. Then you don't have to, pull the big guns, so to speak, right? So this is the first thing that's usually used in order to reduce blood pressure, or the amount of water accumulation in the tissues. Okay? And only if that is not, of course, all these drugs have side effects, which I'm not touching on, right? And only if the thiazide of this group of thiazides is not enough, then you bring out the other guns, like these loop diuretics or ameliorant, right? So finally, we talk about the collecting duct, or the very distal portions of the distal tubule, and it turns out that in this portion, especially the collecting duct, certain portion of the collecting duct that sits in the medulla again, we have a particular type of cell. We have to come back to this portion of the kidney when we talk about acid-base balances. So this type of cell is called a principal cell. It's a very characteristic type of epithelial cells that you find only in this portion of the nephron. And it turns out that these principal cells, they are now involved in additional reabsorption of sodium and also the secretion of potassium. Remember, potassium also flows out of the filtrate in the proximal portion because you have this leaky epithelia, right? But the exact amount of potassium that stays in the filtrate, that is controlled by especially those principal cells. So they're very important for controlling the amount of reabsorption of potassium. If you don't have these particular types of epithelial cells, the principal cells, then the potassium concentration in the filtrate, or of course the blood goes berserk. You know that the increase of potassium inside of body cells, especially in animals, is very critical. Right? For instance, in neurons you generate fewer or less voltage in those action potentials and so forth. Many additional things that occur when potassium concentration is increased. And the resting potential is also affected and so forth. Okay, so potassium is very important. So it happens again on the basolateral membrane through the presence of the sodium-potassium pump. On the apical membrane, sodium enters these cells simply through sodium channels. It's very simple. And this is based on the presence simply, if there are channels present, of course, this is simply based upon diffusion. There's relatively a lot sodium still present in the filtrate, and much less in the cytosol, and of course the basolateral membrane. So sodium flows from where it's plentiful or relatively plentiful to where it's not as plentiful, means the inside, through these channels. Okay. Potassium is just the opposite. Potassium leaves the cytosol where it's plentiful and enters the filtrate, or the space, the lumen of these tubules, in the opposite direction, simply following its concentration gradient by simply diffusion. Okay. It turns out that again the electrogenic gradient that is created here by this different flow of ions favors now the opposite direction. So the basolateral portion becomes slightly positive, the apical portion becomes slightly negative. That means this electrogenic gradient now favors the repulsion, or if you want reabsorption, of anything that is also negatively charged, anions, into the space surrounding the basolateral membrane, for instance, chloride, right? So in these principal cells, you have not only the reabsorption of sodium, but also the reabsorption of chloride happening. And what you have the secretion of potassium ions happening, okay? And so this is the major pathway for potassium excretion or secretion, it's the same thing, in the body, in the animal body. And again, it can be, we mentioned it already, it can be affected by inhibitors, for instance, amiloride. Amiloride blocks the sodium channels in the apical membrane of these principal cells and reduces the reabsorption of sodium. Right? And again, it's not as powerful as loop diuretics because there's much less sodium present in the space, in the filtrate, in the collecting ducts, and the very distal portions of the distal tubule. Okay? But nevertheless, amiloride is able to inhibit those sodium channels and reduce the amount of sodium that's reabsorbed in these portions of the nephron. And we talked about this. And in addition to, so it's less. So this reabsorption of sodium is not affected by thiazides in this portion of the nephron. It's only affected by these non-loop diuretics, these amilorides, just like they reduce the reabsorption in the proximal tubule. Okay. So this is just to remind you that we have these different diuretics outside of these loops of the lymphophane, these limbs of the loop of Henle, means the stilbenes and the amelioride in the proximal tubule, different portions of the epithelial cells, and we have the thiosides that also sit outside. That sit outside of the loop of Henle. Okay. So, just a summary of the principal cells in the collecting ducts, mostly the collecting ducts, but also the very distal portions of the distal tubule. They are mostly involved in the reabsorption of sodium. Like many transport proteins, they can be affected, and they are affected. We'll talk about this in much more detail on Wednesday, by hormones, for instance, aldosterone. So if aldosterone is present, it can affect the amount of reabsorption of sodium and also water, of course, osmotically active substances. Okay? And they will. So it's a very powerful system, these principal cells that are involved in the amount of, this just to show you that aldosterone, and it happens to really affect the sodium-potassium pump on the basolateral membrane and also the sodium channels on the apical membrane. So it's a very powerful tool. How exactly, we don't talk about this. But aldosterone affects the reabsorption of sodium in two ways, on the basolateral membrane, or in the basolateral membrane, by affecting the sodium-potassium pump, and also the apical membrane by affecting the sodium channels. So it's a very powerful hormone that affects the reabsorption of potassium. Okay? So this is just a summary that shows you the amount of sodium that's reabsorbed in these different portions of the nephron. Most of it is about 2/3 or so are absorbed in the proximal portion right away. There's still something left, and it turns out that about 1/4 or so is absorbed in the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. And a little less than 10%, 5 to 10% or so, that still needs to be reabsorbed in the very distal portion of the nephron, distal portions and or the collecting ducts, involving, for instance, those principal cells in the collecting ducts. Right? So this takes care of the reminder of the sodium. So you see that sodium reabsorption is really a very, very powerful tool that also affects not only the amount of sodium that's taken back into the bloodstream, but also the amount of osmotically active substances, for instance, water. Right? Means with it, and of course, the blood pressure. And this is what we have to talk about on Wednesday. Okay? So another important aspect of the thing. And this is just a summary at the end. Potassium secretion means delivery of potassium from the cytosol to the filtrate. That's something that happens mostly at the very end of the nephron. Again, through those principal cells. But also it happens sort of passively in the proximal tubule, as we saw at the beginning. So, and that's basically it. Yeah, I'm going to post those slides.